It's, this evening I want to talk about the extent to which we can decarbonize our boating with current technology and a little look ahead. And what I have for you is just a grab bag of ideas for further thought. Every one of these could be turned into an hour-long presentation and you could probably write a book about it. So we're just going to skim the surface of the topic just to create a conversation, and we'll see where it goes. And as you'll find, I'm not as optimistic as many of you probably are about where we can go with electrification at the moment. So my computer has just frozen, Alicia. Let's see, there we go.
Oh, there you are.
So we're obviously seeing, now it's all right. Technology. So we're obviously seeing profound changes in our attitudes to energy consumption. We're seeing this much more in Europe than we are in the USA, although we're seeing partly over here. And in Europe, they have something called the Recreational Craft Directive, which is the RCD there in this slide. And that basically governs recreational boating in Europe. They review it every 5 years. And they basically set the framework for where they're going to go in the next 5 years. And so whatever they do with the RCD is going to have a significant impact on what they do in Europe, and that is going to spill over into the States and have a significant impact over here. So I'm going to look a little bit at the legal framework, and I'm going to look at some of the technical challenges in trying to decarbonize our boating. And in particular, I'm going to look at where we can go with electric propulsion with the existing technology. So I have a couple of slides here that relate to Europe. The highlight in yellow is the current EU targets for electrification of recreational boating. And you can see there by 2035, they want all the small boats within Europe to meet the emission standard that are applicable to inland vessels, etc. That actually includes fossil fuel engines. And then boats with an electric or fuel cell propulsion system represent at least 25% of the small boat market in Europe. So that's not a very ambitious objective there. That's 2035, that's almost 15 years out, and they're still only looking at 25% of boats to be emissions free, and the rest of them can still have fossil fueled engines so long as they comply with the applicable emission standards. But then they have another track within Europe, which is this one, which wants by 2025, which is only 3 years away, 50% of propulsion engines of leisure boats are converted to non-fossil fuel propulsion. 30% of European ports are carbon neutral and provide electricity at the berth, which is to say, if a ship comes in with some carbon source, they've got to come into harbor, carbon neutral, and then they'll plug in, ideally, to carbon neutral electricity or energy. And then by 2030, 100% of propulsion engines of leisure boats are converted to non-fossil propulsion. So that's a really ambitious agenda. So we're going to end up somewhere between those two, a very low-level objective by 2035, and then a fairly aggressive objective by 2030. And then we're going to see individual countries drive this as well. They had the COP conference in Glasgow last year in November in England, I should say in Scotland. The Scots would be pretty offended at that. They announced at that conference that by 2025, all new ships being built for operation in the UK's zone within the North Sea have to be emissions free. In other words, no carbon emissions whatsoever. So that's a really aggressive agenda, which is going to be legally enforced. And then within the UK, from 2013 to 2030, internal combustion engine cars will no longer be sold in the UK. Now, the old fleet will still be around, but the new cars will all be electric or fuel cells. And at that point, we're going to see that fuel availability will begin to phase out in some of these countries. So the individual countries are going to drive the agenda at a faster pace than what we're seeing at the legislative level, at the European level. Within Norway, they already have a program to electrify their marinas and provide charging stations in all the marinas so that people can coast hop up and down the coast of Norway without using the fossil fuel engine at all. That they can go into the marinas and plug in and recharge and then carry on from there. So what does it take to get carbon neutral transportation? Well, you either have to produce the carbon neutral fuel supply that you need to move the car or the boat or whatever it is at the point of use, or you've got to supply it from carbon neutral sources and store it within the car or the boat. So at the moment, of course, with cars, we can store a substantial amount of electrical energy in lithium-ion batteries. And we can get it with some cars now, we can get a 300 or 400 mile range. But it's a lot different when we get to boats. So let's get rid of that. There we go. So the two huge differences between boats and cars are that when a car gets up to what you might call cruising speeds on the interstate, as long as it's not going uphill and as long as there's no headwinds, the loads are actually quite light. The energy is absorbed in getting up to those speeds, and then once you get there, you're coasting. A boat is entirely different. It takes less energy to get up to cruising speeds than it would in a car, but as you get closer and closer to cruising speeds, the energy demand just keeps going up and up and up. So once we get to cruising speeds, the energy demands are really high. So that makes it very difficult to store enough energy on a boat, electrical energy, to operate at cruising speeds for any length of time. And then in the car, every time you brake, you can recover some of that energy and turn it back into electricity and store it in the batteries. In a boat, we effectively have no regenerative braking. So those two things together amount to a radically different duty cycle for boats, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to store enough electrical energy on a boat to have any kind of range whatsoever. Now, we can electrify all kinds of short-range boating activities. If, for example, you have a sailboat and you only use the engine to get out of the slip, and then you go sailing and then you use the engine to get back into slip, then it's entirely feasible to electrify the boat, to take the diesel engine or the gasoline engine out of the boat and put an electric motor in there on a reasonably modest battery bank and get in and out of the slip. But then we're going to find, if we start electrifying a whole lot of short-range boats like that, and incidentally, we can also electrify ski boats, wakeboard boats. These are boats that have very high energy demands, but they typically don't operate for more than an hour or two. So then it becomes feasible to put enough batteries on the boat to for them to play around for an hour or two, skiing or wakeboarding, and then go back to the dock and recharge the batteries. But then we're going to discover that we have almost no infrastructure for handling high recharge loads. So if we electrify a whole ton of boats and they all go back to the marina at the same time on a Saturday afternoon, we're not going to have the ability to charge those batteries. And in fact, many years ago in Austria, they have a large lake, which they made fossil-free in the 60s. And there was a boat builder on the lake, Frauscher, and they built a whole load of electric boats going back into the 70s with big enough battery banks for people to water ski behind them. And then they would come back on a Saturday evening after they'd all been out playing on the lake and all plug in and recharge. And they actually crashed the substation for the local town. So they had to build a new substation for the entire town to deal with the loads from the marina. And we're going to find we have similar kinds of problems within the US as we start to electrify more boats. We're going to find there are some significant limitations in terms of shoreside infrastructure. So the core problem we've got is that if you look at the energy density of lithium-ion batteries, even the most powerful of them, if we look at it in terms of volume, or we look at it in terms of weight, we discovered that diesel and gasoline have 20 to 100 times the energy density of an equivalent sized or weight lithium-ion battery. So if we have a tank and we replace it with an equivalent size lithium-ion battery bank, we're going to have 20 to 100 times less energy to propel the boat than we would have if we had the tank in the first place and just filled it with gasoline and diesel. That's the fundamental problem that we're dealing with at the moment. And there are currently no mechanisms to store sufficient electrical energy on a boat to have any significant range. So if you want to go more than an hour or two at cruising speeds on almost any boat with electric propulsion, you end up killing the batteries, and then you've got to have some means of generating electricity, which puts us back to a fossil fuel engine. So I've got a slide here which compares the energy density of various fuel sources, which is a bit more complicated than what I just said. So we're going to qualify that 20 to 100 times ratio and look at it in a bit more detail. If we go on energy content, the WH is watt hours. It's just a measurement of energy, a unit of energy. And the kg is kilograms. It's a unit of weight. So we're just looking at energy density here. If we look at lead acid batteries, that's the PBA, and in particular AGM batteries, absorbed glass mat, which I know many of you have, the energy density is 30 to 50 watt hours per kilogram. When we look at lithium ion, it's 100 to 265, so many times higher than lead acid. And then we look at diesel fuel, it's 12,500. So right there, we can see the problem. And then if we look at the next parameter there, usable watt hours per kilogram, in practice, we never like to discharge our lead acid batteries beyond 50% state of charge. So of the 30 to 50 watt hours per kilogram we've got, we're actually only able to use 10 to 25. And then if we look at the lithium ion batteries, we can use basically on most charge discharge cycles about 70%. So we've got 70 to 185 watt hours per kilogram usable. And when it comes to diesel, we can keep running the engine until the tank is empty. So we can use all of it. So we've still got the 12,500. So the disparity is even greater than it was just looking at the nominal capacities of these different devices. However, we get to one factor here that actually works in our favor, which is when we look at the productive use of that energy. When we're looking at electric propulsion systems, most of them are 80% efficient or higher in terms of converting electrical energy into propulsion power. A diesel engine at best is only 30 to 35% efficient. And typically speaking, in our boat applications, we're running at between 10 and 30% efficiency. So all of a sudden that 12,500 watt hours per kilogram in terms of effective usable energy gets dropped down to 1250 to 4,000. Still a huge difference with lithium ion, but it does narrow the gap substantially. And that's really the only metric that counts, is how much of this energy in whatever system we're talking about can we put to productive use, rather than what's the theoretical value of these different systems. Is this too much for this time of night? With lithium ion, the efficiency has just been climbing steadily for years. And that's what this graph is showing. So for a given size of cell, we're getting over twice the energy density that we got just like 10 or 15 years ago. But if you look at the top end of the graph there, you can see it's beginning to flatten off. We're starting to get fairly close to some of the theoretical limits of what we can do with lithium ion. And then if we look at the price has come down steadily again over the last 20, 30 years. It just keeps on coming down. And in the boat world, we haven't seen that so much because we're a small, low volume marketplace. So we don't get the benefits of scale, but certainly in the automotive world, the cost has been coming down steadily and keeps on going down. So we have other issues we have to look at in terms of any kind of battery, lead acid or lithium ion. And I've got some of them in this slide. I'm not going to dig into them other than to say that there's a lot more that goes into figuring out how to put these technologies to use than just looking at energy density and what's the usable amount of energy we've got. There are all sorts of issues related to charge acceptance rates. Well, I'll deal with that one quickly because most lithium-ion batteries that we have in the boat world can't be charged faster than 30% of their rated capacity. So if you go out with a boat and you run your battery almost flat and you come back to the dock and you need to recharge it, it's going to take you 3 hours to recharge it. As opposed to if you have a boat with a diesel or gasoline engine, you come into the dock and it takes 5 minutes to refuel. So there's a huge difference there in the time it takes to put the energy back in the boat. And then there are other factors like cycle life and operating costs, which we can quantify in different ways. And the cost of maintenance with electric boats, it's basically close to zero, as opposed to fairly high with gasoline and diesel engines. And then, of course, there are lifestyle issues. Most of the boats that I deal with that want a significant level of electrification, they're actually not worried about the cost. It's the noise and the emissions that they want to get away from. So they'll pay a lot of money for a lifestyle improvement, which is unrelated to other issues that we've got there. So I have here a boat that Torqeedo has electrified as a tour boat in Berlin. It's got 120 kilowatt hour battery pack, which is a huge battery pack. Effectively, much of the bottom of that boat is filled up with batteries. It enables the boat to operate for 8 hours, which is the time that they run the tours in Berlin. And then they have to recharge it, which they do overnight. So here we need overnight charging. So we're looking at multiple hours for charging. It's not like filling up a tank of fuel. And then we need a shoreside infrastructure that's capable of charging 120 kilowatt hour battery pack overnight. That's a pretty high charge rate. In terms of your household energy use, that's probably kind of like running a dryer continuously. One of your dryers is plugged into 240 volts. It's pretty similar to that, running it all night long. So we're talking a fair amount of energy being pumped back into the batteries. We can either do this with fast charging stations, which requires even bigger energy supplies, basically huge energy supplies, a level which none of us could do at home. We simply don't have that much energy available. Or else they're finding in some of these situations, they have to fill a container with batteries. So they've got an enormous bank of batteries. They park it on the dock side. The boat comes in, the tour boat, plugs in and recharges fairly quickly from the batteries that are in the container. And then they recharge the container overnight from the grid when most people are in bed and their loads on the grid are much lower. So then they can recharge the container of batteries. But all of this, of course, adds a lot of cost and complexity to the process, which we're going to have to address over here once we get into more electric boating. And finally, of course, if the recharge energy that we're using to recharge these batteries is coming from a coal-powered fuel station, we have gained absolutely nothing in terms of reducing the carbon footprint of our boating. So then there has to be a shoreside supply that's based on carbon neutral sources to recharge our batteries. So there are some really interesting things going on in the car world in terms of improving lithium-ion battery technology. Tesla is basically focusing on their more or less conventional lithium-ion cells and just optimizing them with larger cells and more efficiency and so on and so forth. And they're getting a substantial increase in energy density from doing that, and also the rate at which they can charge and discharge them. The really interesting stuff is going on with some of the other car manufacturers, GM, Volkswagen, I think Ford now. They're all investing in something called lithium metal as opposed to lithium ion. We have known since the 1970s that a lithium metal battery has a ton more energy density than a lithium ion battery, but nobody has ever been able to build one that didn't catch fire. These various car manufacturers have all said that they've cracked that problem. And in fact, in the case of GM and Volkswagen, they've said that they'll have lithium metal batteries in their cars by 2025, which is only 3 years away. And if this is true, this will represent a qualitative improvement in the battery technology. We're not talking small changes here. I have a slide here that talks about the energy density of different ways of making, theoretical ways of making these batteries. None of these are real. Right now, the energy density of lithium-ion batteries, the best of them, the most energy dense, is between 250 to 270 watt hours per kilogram. If we look at lithium metal there, which I've highlighted, the theoretical energy density is 5,210 watt hours per kilogram. In other words, that's what, 20 times more than what we're currently getting. If we realize even a fraction of that, we're going to get batteries which in a given space or weight contain 4 or 5 times as much energy as we've got right now. And then that vastly expands the range for electric boating. It makes a qualitative change to the environment in which we're operating. So it may be within 3 years that these technologies are viable and they start to filter down into our world, in which case we're going to see a really radical change in our operating environment. Every incremental gain in energy density and the expansion of the range of boats to which we can electrify the propulsion side increases the stresses on the shoreside infrastructure. So if we get this kind of battery technologies, it won't do us a whole lot of good if we don't at the same time improve the shoreside infrastructure. At the moment, there is no organized way of reviewing this and trying to apply technology to the shoreside side of things. The National Marine Manufacturers Association, which is the body that lobbies on behalf of boat builders, is starting to look at this. But in the US, we have such a broken up power supply system. Like in Maine, we have CMP, and then we have a couple of other power companies, and every other state is the same. It's really hard to get any kind of coordinated policy that would see us creating the infrastructure that we're going to need if we get a rapid electrification of boating. In other countries, there's more centralized, and in particular, as I mentioned, in Norway, they actually have a national program run by the government to electrify their marinas. So then, assuming that we're still going to have shoreside problems, how about generating the electricity on board? So the most effective mechanism we have right now is solar panels. This is my own boat looking at it from above. There's a 340 watts of solar there. And the efficiency of solar has been steadily improving over the last decade or so. It's gone from about 16% efficiency to 24 or 25% efficiency. That doesn't sound like much. That's only an 8% increase from 16 to 24%. But 8% as a fraction of 16% is 50%. So actually, we've improved the energy density, so to speak, of our solar panels by 50% over the last 10 or 15 years, which is pretty impressive. I'm not sure that we're going to see the same rate of improvement in coming years, but in the lab, they actually have solar panels that are almost 100% more efficient than what we have right now. So maybe we will see that kind of rate of improvement over the next 10 or 15 years. This still won't get us where we need to be in terms of propulsion loads, because of that business that when we're at cruising speeds, the loads are always high. If you take my own boat, it takes 7 kilowatts to move the boat at 6 knots in flat water with no headwinds. So for 2 hours, that's 14 kilowatt hours of electricity. A 22 square feet of solar panel area, roughly speaking, will generate about a kilowatt hour a day of electricity on a boat, given shading and other issues. So to power my boat for 2 hours at 6 knots, I'm going to need 14 times 22 square feet of solar panels on the boat, which there's no way I could fit that on the boat. And that's the case for most boats. So there's let me just stop. Sorry about that. Yep. So even on a catamaran, if you cover the entire deck with solar panels, typically speaking, you can't move the boat at more than 3 or 4 knots. That's when the sun is shining. And then obviously overnight, you don't have the electrical energy you need to move the boat with an electric motor. So there's no practical way with solar at the current time and for the foreseeable future that we can meet our propulsion needs from solar panels on a boat. We can meet the house needs, run the fridge, maybe a freezer, and pumps, lights, that kind of stuff. But we can't meet the propulsion needs because they're so much higher. And then once we run out of solar energy and we've discharged the batteries, we're back to some form of a fossil fuel to generate the energy that we need to move the boat through the water. And we have to run a generator to recharge the batteries so we can run the electric motors. So here's a boat, another Torpedo project. This is a relatively short range little ferry boat that goes out to an island off the coast of Denmark, I think. So they have 80 kilowatt hour battery pack, which again is an enormous battery pack. Probably the entire area under the deck there is filled up with batteries. They've got a fair amount of solar on the boat. And they can run it 8 kilometers, which is what, 5 or 6 miles an hour, for enough time to get out of the island and go back again. There's no way they can run that boat under the solar power, and there's no way they can run it for for hours at a time with the batteries. But because it's a fairly short range ferry, they have the opportunity at either end of the trip to plug into shore power and recharge the batteries. So that's a very effective electrical installation, solely because the runs are fairly short and they're predictable. So it's not like all of a sudden they're going to decide to take off and go for 3 or 4 hours in another direction, at which point they'll run out of battery power, they won't have enough solar power, and basically they might be able to make 2 or 3 knots under solar when the sun is shining, and they'll be dead in the water when it's not. So what about wind and water? Wind power is strictly related to the diameter of the blades, and obviously we can't put humongous blades on a boat. So effectively we can't get that much energy out of the wind. And on top of that, we spend most of our time in anchorages or harbors, and by definition, these are protected. So then there's very little wind speed, so we get very little wind power. We spent 3 summers in Scotland where the weather is miserable, the sun almost never shines, and there's lots of wind. We had an average of a gale a week. And even so, the solar that we had on the boat outperformed our wind generator by 2 to 1. And the reason for that is, although the weather was miserable, up in Scotland at 60 degrees north, there's 16 to 18 hours of daylight a day. So the solar was operating at a low level, but for many hours. And we were hiding from the gales most of the time. So we didn't see the wind that we needed to operate the wind generator. So in general, wind generation on a boat is very intermittent and doesn't contribute significantly to the energy needs on the boat. What about fuel cells? Most of the fuel cells we see around require hydrogen to operate, and there is no hydrogen infrastructure. It's not like you can pull into a marina and fill your tank with hydrogen. So there's no way we've got an infrastructure for this. So then we have to create hydrogen on board the boat. And the only fuel cells at the moment that are out there that are doing that use a methanol, which is the hydrocarbon. And the process is extraordinarily inefficient. And it doesn't make any sense whatsoever from either from a cost of electricity or from a generating point of view or from carbon reduction point of view. There's no real rationality to this at the moment, other than the fact that the boat owners like the fact that they're getting some low level of electricity with no noise, which the fuel cell provides with them. There have been other projects where we take water and we crack it into the hydrogen and oxygen, which it's composed of, and then we use the hydrogen to run a fuel cell. This is called hydrolyzing. The EU has some interesting projects where they're using offshore wind to do that. But again, it doesn't make sense from an efficiency perspective. They only do it when the offshore wind platforms are so far from the coast that it's incredibly expensive to run cables to shore. So instead of doing that, they use the electricity they're generating to crack water to make hydrogen that they store on the platform, and then they pick it up in barges. So I see no way that fuel cells are going to be viable in the recreational boating world anytime in the foreseeable future. And I've been on the fringes of 3 failed fuel cell projects where collectively they spent well over $100 million, and nobody can crack this. in the recreational boat world. In the shipping world, we're going to see some hydrogen for the zero pollution areas because the ships are going from one port to another, so they can create the infrastructure at both ends to deal with it. And I got a slide here which deals with the energy density of hydrogen compared to diesel. And again, the bottom line is it doesn't look very good. So away from the dock, fossil-free electricity is not practicable for sustained propulsion. It is for short-range propulsion, but it's not for sustained propulsion. And even for house loads, if you've got significant house loads, if, for example, you want to run air conditioning on a boat, it's almost impossible to do that from fossil-free energy sources, mostly solar. So we're driven back to using what we're using right now, alternators, battery chargers at anchor, generators, and so on. We've got, as a kind of interim technology, which theoretically improves efficiency substantially, hybrids. We have two types of hybrids. We have serial and parallel. The goal with both of them is that to restrict fossil fuel use, engine run time, to as little as possible, and then to make sure whenever an engine is running, that it's operating at peak efficiency. So our carbon footprint per unit of energy produced is as low as we can make it with that particular engine. And then if we can't run the engine at peak efficiency, we run off batteries in the interim until the batteries go down, and then we recharge the batteries and we make sure that the load on the engine is such that we put the engine at peak efficiency. And we have two ways of doing this. One is called a serial hybrid and one is a parallel. So a serial hybrid, we put a big electric motor on the propeller shaft, which is what we can see on the left-hand side there. And then we have a generator in the background. And we run the electric motor off the batteries until they go down, and then we crank the generator, and we make sure that the load on the generator puts it at its peak efficiency, so that we minimize the carbon footprint for the energy we're creating. With a parallel hybrid, we have the engine connected to the propeller shaft as we normally would, and then we add an auxiliary electric motor. And anytime we've got low loads, we operate the electric motor when we want low speed propulsion in harbor and getting in and out of slips and so on. And anytime we need more energy for propulsion, we crank the engine and we run the engine, at which point it's reasonably efficient. So those are the two systems we have. The serial is like the Chevy Volts that we've had. They've taken it out of service now, but the old Chevy Volts, they had electric propulsion in the car. Effectively, you're driving the wheels with an electric motor, and then there's a generator in the car, and you can do all of your local runs up to 30 or 40 miles on the batteries and plug in when you get home. And then if you go long distance, you decide to drive cross country, the engine kicks in and drives a generator, which provides electricity for the electric motors that are driving the wheels. So that's a serial hybrid. And then a parallel would be like a Toyota Prius. And those of you that have Priuses know when you're driving down the interstate, you can actually hear the engine kicking in and out. And when it kicks out, you're running off the batteries get discharged. And when the discharge level is low enough to where you can optimize the engine running time, put it at its peak efficiency, the engine fires up, recharges the batteries, and then shuts down again. So that's a parallel hybrid. I think I'm going to skip these next two slides. It gets a little too technical for this. I think for the time we've got and the evening time we're at, I'm just going to get to the core here. With a serial system, once the batteries go down and you fire up the generator to recharge the batteries and to provide electrical energy to the propulsion motor, you've got serial losses. You've got losses in the generator, you've got losses in the cabling, you've got losses in the device that controls the motor, and you've got losses in the motor. And these all add up. The net result of this is that if you are running the engine, the generator, to provide electricity for the electric motor, we've discharged the batteries and now we've got the generator running. As soon as you crank the generator, that system is less efficient than if the engine that's driving the generator had been connected to the propeller shaft in the first place. This is not what anybody wants to hear. But that's the reality with these serial systems. If you can, most of the time, run on batteries, you do just short trips. You go in and out of the slip and you recharge from the carbon neutral shore power energy. And you only intermittently run the generator when you do make a longer trip once in a while. Then the serial system looks pretty good. But if your regular duty cycle requires you to fire up the generator so that you can extend the range of the boat, you would be better off having a conventional system in the first place, from an efficiency perspective and from a carbon footprint perspective. But the other problem with serial hybrids is that in order to drive the boat, you've got only the electric motor on the propeller shaft. So that electric motor has to have an equivalent power to the diesel or gasoline engine that would have been there in the first place. So it has to be a big electric motor. So, and these big electric motors are expensive. So historically, the boat builders have always cut corners here and put in smaller electric motors. And the net result is that pretty much every serial hybrid that has been put into the marketplace has been a failure because they've been underpowered and less efficient than a conventional installation. And there have been boat builders that have produced runs of 40 and 50 and 60 serial hybrid boats, and they've ended up retrofitting all of them with diesel engines after the fact. So there are a lot of issues in terms of trying to reduce the carbon footprint with serial hybrids, which make it very difficult to do it. There's an awful lot of nonsense talked about improving efficiency with these systems, and unless they're very carefully calibrated for a very specific duty cycle, many times they're less efficient than a standard installation. The parallel hybrids actually offer much more opportunity for modest improvements in efficiency and reductions in carbon footprint, because you have a much smaller electric motor. It's not required to drive the boat at all speeds. It's only required to drive it at low speeds. And then the engine in the boat is used for going at cruising speeds. So all of those times when the engine is really chronically inefficient, we run the boat on electric propulsion through the parallel hybrid motor. And then anytime the loads get to be fairly high, we crank the engine, at which point it's fairly efficient. And we also use the engine at that point to recharge the batteries, just as we do in a Toyota Prius. So we can optimize those systems in a way that we can't with a serial hybrid. But it requires a lot of expensive and complex electronics and control strategies. And Toyota spent hundreds of millions of dollars perfecting the Prius. And we don't have that kind of money in the boat world. So to date, the parallel hybrids have been very crudely optimized, which has then traded away many of the potential benefits of the system. The most successful in the marketplace is this one here from Greenline. They've produced hundreds of these boats. They have a parallel hybrid in them. But they basically have a switch in there. If you want electric propulsion at low speeds, you flip the switch to electric propulsion. And if you want to go faster, you switch the flip to diesel engine. And so doing it that way, it gets rid of all of the complexities and makes it much easier for the boat builder to install and for the owner to operate. But it also gets rid of the level of sophistication that you need to optimize the system. So there's probably very little gain in terms of carbon footprint with these boats. So I know this isn't what you want to hear, but in principle, we can decarbonize day sailors and short haul propulsion, depending on the shore power energy available, which is to say, if it's not a carbon-free source, we haven't achieved much. We don't have the infrastructure to do this in a big way. We cannot currently decarbonize most offshore boating because of the range issues. And even if we could, if we do a cradle to grave analysis of the carbon footprint of an electric boat, including building the batteries and the electric motors and so on and so forth, we often find that the carbon footprint over the life of the boat is just as high as it would be if we'd been burning fossil fuels fairly efficiently, which again is not something that most of us want to hear, but that's the current state of the technology. And then there are all kinds of issues that we brush under the carpet with electric systems, and particularly with lithium-ion batteries. The mining of the lithium salts is done in third world countries mostly, with appalling environmental records. And then most of our lithium-ion batteries have cobalt in them, which comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where they use both what is effectively slave labor and child labor in the mines. So there are a lot of social and political issues associated with our greening of our boat systems that we tend to ignore and try to just pretend they don't exist, and which we need to address. So fundamentally, we're scratching at the surface of the problem. And so then what about coming back to a fossil fueled engine, but making the fuels carbon neutral, which is something that we've ignored as a possibility, but the aircraft industry is being forced to do this because the aircraft industry is going to have to go carbon neutral within 5 or 10 years. And there's no way at the moment that they can see that they can electrify planes, the propulsion side of planes. So they've got to find a way to get carbon neutral fuels for their jet engines, and we can do it. There are now processes, manufacturing processes that exist in prototype form, where you do carbon capture from the atmosphere. You take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and then you take solar power or wind power, so a carbon neutral energy source, and you use that to hydrolyze water. So you crack the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and then you mix the hydrogen with the carbon that you've captured, and you make a fuel, a hydrocarbon, and you make jet fuel. And they can do that right now. It's extraordinarily expensive, but that's not to say that as they refine the processes that we can't do this at scale and get the cost down to where it's effective. And then it would only be a small step from there to take these effectively carbon neutral hydrocarbons and turn them into fuels that are appropriate for diesel engines and gasoline engines. So there is a potential here for extending the life of our engines with carbon neutral fuels. And I got 2 more slides here, and then I'm going to wrap it up, Alicia, because I know we're running out of time. I have here my own boat, where I'm looking at boat speed across the bottom, and I'm looking at the amount of fuel burned up the side. And do you see these tiny little barnacles on the propeller? Just hardly anything at all. Those small handful of barnacles on that propeller reduce the fuel efficiency such that at any given speed, we consume 50% more fuel, or at any given fuel level, we lose a knot or two of speed. So those few barnacles are disrupting the flow over the surface of the propeller and making a huge impact on the efficiency of the propeller. So imagine what it's like if we had a lot more fouling of the prop. And then we've got some data here. Looking again at my boat, I had on it very accurate fuel and other measurement. And as we load up the engine, we're looking at the fuel consumption per unit of energy produced, and it steadily goes down. So when we get to 8 knots of boat speed, we're burning 260 units of energy per fuel per unit of energy produced, whereas at idle, we're burning 3 times that. So it looks like the key way to run this boat is at 8 knots. But if we look at the miles per gallon that we're getting, we discover, I think it's hidden behind those. How do I get rid of this? Anyway, the bottom line is, if we look at the miles per gallon, we'll discover that the slower we go, the more miles we get per gallon. And that's because although as we speed up, the engine becomes more efficient as we load it more heavily, that whole hull resistance curve that I started out with, when we get to cruising speeds in a boat, the loads are really high, that resistance is going up faster than the fuel efficiency is improving. So we're burning more fuel per mile traveled the faster we go, even though the engine is 3 times as efficient as it would be operating at just above idle speed. So the bottom line here is that if you really want to save your carbon footprint right now with existing technology, you need to clean the propeller and go slower. And then pending a major technological breakthrough, there's not a lot we can do right now to reduce our carbon footprint with our boating. Clean the prop and go slower. Particularly going slower, if you drop your top speed by a knot or two, you'll probably reduce your fuel consumption per mile to a half. It makes a fairly radical difference. And then you reduce your carbon footprint substantially. So that's what I have here. That's kind of rather mixed bag of information. Let me get out of here and we'll see if we've got any questions. I hope that wasn't too much at this time of night. I just wanted to throw a bunch of ideas on the table so you can go home and think about it.
Nigel is fantastic. Fantastic. Hey, I have a question for you. Have you written or can you recommend a guide for a boat owner who wants to replace a generator from solar for non-propulsion needs?
So, to put solar in for non-propulsion? Well, there's a lot of quality panels on the market, semi-flexible, or you can use household panels if you're going to build a platform to put them on. But the key thing, if you're going to go for anything other than the solid household panels, because they're very well built, they have to be built to certain standards. In the boat world, we have no standards. We got a very high failure rate with a lot of these flexible and semi-flexible panels. So I would say the key there is to look at the rated efficiency of the panel, and you want to see it above 20%. And then to look at the warranty, and you want to see at least a 5-year non-prorated warranty, which is to say, if it fails inside of 5 years, they give you a free panel instead of saying, oh, it's been 4 years, so we're only going to give you a 20% rebate. And that will help to weed out some of the lower quality panels. But even at the high end of the marketplace, we've had problems at times with batch failures. So there's no guarantee that you're going to get a panel that's going to hold for 10 years. The panels on my boat have been on there for 15 years and they're still doing great. But they're, rigid household style panels that I put on a solid mount.
And Nigel, how about panel manufacturer recommendations? Well,
the probably the two top brands available in the States are Solvian and Solara. Oh, and actually, the Merlin, it's an outfit from California that they have a really interesting grid structure, which is excellent. Now, you can get all of these panels through a local company, Ocean Planet Energy, and I need to say right up front that I have a small stake in the company, so I do have a commercial relationship with them. But they're probably the #1 distributor for these high-end panels in the state. But then the other thing that's really important here is to break the panels up into individual panels and put a separate controller on each panel. Because on a boat, we inevitably have shading. And if you tie the panels together in any way, either in series or parallel to a common controller, and one of them gets shaded, it really knocks the heck out of the output. So what we want is to have each panel to have its own controller. And then that would really optimize the output.
Nigel, can you share with us where?
Oh, actually, Alicia, could I say one more thing on that?
Yeah, please.
I have multiple times calculated what it costs to generate electrical energy on a boat, battery charging an anchor or running a generator, including the amortization cost, which is, let's say we have an engine that the installed cost is $20,000 and it's got a life expectancy of 5,000 hours. It costs us $4 an hour to run the engine, regardless of whether it does anything. That's the amortization cost. If you build that into the cost of energy, along with the fuel cost and inefficiencies and so on and so forth, you discover that most of the time we're battery charging an anchor, energy cost is somewhere between $6 a kilowatt hour and $20. And you're paying, in Maine, we're paying 15 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity that's now costing us $6 to $20. And when you do the same calculation with AC generators, it's generally between about $5 and $10 a kilowatt hour. So when you look at the cost of creating energy on a boat from that perspective, when running a fossil fueled engine, solar starts to look really good. The payback on solar on a full-time liveaboard cruising boat is probably less than a year, even if you buy expensive solar. And of course, if you only use the boat at one weekend a year, then it doesn't pencil out.
Nigel, can you share with us what the life expectancy is of flexible solar panels?
Well, again, that's very dependent on the manufacturer and the installation. If it's on top of a bimini, a canvas, and it's zipped on, and the bimini is flapping up and down, sooner or later you're going to crack the all of the internal bus bars, and it's going to fail. If it's, say, glued to a deck and you don't drop a winch on it and crack the cells, there's no reason why it shouldn't last 10 years or 15 years. I mean, basically the life expectancy of a panel, if it's in a non-destructive environment, is 25, 30 years. Our household panels are all warranted for typically for 25 years. So it's really down to the installation as much as anything to make sure the panel doesn't get stressed.
Yep. That's good information. Nigel, can you think about something that that can provide us like a source, like a blog or something to read about solar installations and like how to retrofit your boat? Is there like a forum that you would suggest, or a collect?
You're talking to the wrong person, Alicia. I don't do Facebook or blogs or any social media whatsoever. I'm a Luddite when it comes to this sort of stuff. One time I was asked to write a blog on when we were doing some hybrid testing for the European Union, and they wanted me to write a blog, and it was like pulling teeth to get me to do 2 entries a year. So I think if you just do an internet search, there's quite a bit of good information on the Ocean Planet Energy site, oceanplanetenergy.com, but there's lots of others with good information on there.
Awesome. All right, another question for you, Nigel. I'm curious if the reverse cycle HVAC technology will soon reach the point where it is reasonable to run them sustainably on a boat. I've seen new style 24-volt variable speed DC types, but curious of their robustness long-term, considering I'll be moving from 8 240-volt classic Cruiser units from the 80s.
Yeah, so we've got some much more efficient air conditioning in the marketplace now than we've had in the past. My favorite company, and I have no commercial relationship with them, is Termodinamica, an Italian company, Termodinamica. And so you used to, basically the rule of thumb was that a 16,000 BTU air conditioner, which is what you'd need to cool down a fairly large cabin on a catamaran, would pull about 1.5 kilowatts when it was running. And now we've got these devices down to 1,200 watts, 1.2 kilowatts when they get going, and then they taper down. So there's some substantial efficiencies there. And then also with the kind of battery storage we've got now with lithium-ion batteries, it's entirely feasible, and lots of boats do it, to run air conditioning on a 4 or 5 cabin boat all night long without running a generator, because of the improved efficiency of the air conditioning and the amount of energy we can store in lithium-ion batteries. We can do that kind of thing where we can't do propulsion, but then of course in the morning you've got to recharge the batteries, so then you need a fairly powerful charging system on the boat. But one of the devices I helped to develop is a kilowatt, is an alternator that puts out 8 kilowatts, which if that was 12 volts would be 700 amps. I mean, it's a humongous output from an alternator. And then you can take a boat with air conditioning that's running all night long, and then the next morning, in the time it takes the boat to maybe shuffle from one mooring buoy to another or whatever, if they're in the Virgin Islands, they can put enough energy in the batteries to replace what they used overnight. So we do have these technologies out there, and we can do all these things. They're all expensive, of course. There's nothing cheap in the boat world. I used to think about you when it was $1,000 and now I think it's $4,000.
Oh, Nigel, can you share with us where is North America in regards to their goals for conversion of recreation and commercial vessels?
Convert them to electrical.
Yeah.
I don't think we have any targets at all. And I haven't looked at the Inflation Reduction Act and all the money they're putting into to reducing the carbon footprint in the States. I doubt very much there's anything in there that's targeted at the recreational boat world. Now, in the shipping world, we do have emissions reduced zones, and actually San Diego is going to make it an emissions-free port, and they have the first totally electric tugboat going into service in San Diego next year in a few months. And that's an interesting example of the problems that this leads to, because obviously for a tug, it's got to have an enormous amount of power. So it's got huge electric motors. It's got huge battery bank, and there's no shoreside infrastructure powerful enough to fast charge the tug, which they need to do in between pushing barges around. So that's another case where they're going to create an enormous battery bank on shore, a container or more of batteries, where the tug can come in, plug in, recharge in maybe 20, 30 minutes, and then go back and carry on working. And then they'll recharge the container load of batteries from a reduced shore power capability over time. But I think that's the first port in the States that's going to go completely fossil free in terms of shipping. We have a lot of ports now where the ships can't run their generators dockside. They have to plug in and run everything from shore power, which of course doesn't help much if the shore power is generated from coal.
Yeah. I wonder if they'll use solar panels in San Diego to help with that challenge.
You need an awful lot of solar panels. I mean, fields of them. But of course, on shore, where we don't have the space constraints, it becomes feasible to do that, to have huge solar farms.
Mm-hmm.
I flew over the North Sea a couple of weeks ago, and it was a clear day. Couldn't believe all the wind farms out there. From where we went from basically East Anglia to Amsterdam, that particular trajectory, the areas covered with solar farms were greater than the open spaces between the solar farms.
Wow.
It's like the whole of the southern North Sea is one huge solar farm now.
Wow.
So we can do these things. And I think Denmark, it's in almost its entire electricity supply now is fossil free.
Oh.
It's just having the political will and investing the resources in it.
Yeah. Nigel, can you speak to how well the small 3 horsepower equivalent electric outboards, Torpedo e-propulsion, can propel, say, an 18-foot catboat with 2,200 pounds displacement and a 500-pound ballast, if one is happy with 3 knots? The marketing numbers are all based on short and light fishing boats.
So you would probably start out by figuring out what size of outboard motor you would normally use to push that boat if you wanted to have some kind of equivalent performance. And then you can probably take that outboard motor power and cut it in half for an electric outboard motor, because the outboard motor has got a lot of losses. The gasoline-powered outboard motor has a lot of losses in the drive shaft and the gear changing angles that take place in it. Whereas the electric motor, they put the motor in the pod in the water, so it's a direct drive to the propeller. So you get rid of those losses, and on top of that, most of these electric propulsion motors swing a bigger propeller at slow speed, and that's inherently more efficient, particularly if you're driving a displacement boat like a small sailboat. That's more efficient than an outboard motor. So you might be able to get away with half the theoretical power and get almost the same performance out of your electric propulsion. But if you start to go much below that, you're going to find that if the wind picks up or there's a little bit of wave action, you're dead in the water. You simply won't have any power to move the boat.
Okay, last question for this evening, Nigel. Seeing as how fresh water is becoming a pretty precious resource, is there infrastructure to its cost, where it is cost effective to be hydrolyzing salt water?
I don't know is the short answer. I mean, obviously we have enormous reverse osmosis plants on shore in some countries now where they're short of water, but I have no idea what the economics of that are. My guess is it's typically driven by a desperate need for water rather than by it being more economical than getting water by other means. But certainly on a boat, it's a pretty expensive process making water, just because of the cost of making the electrical energy to drive the water maker.
For sure. Nigel, fantastic evening. Lovely to have you here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks for saying yes. All right, well, have a wonderful evening. Thank you all for being here. And Nigel, thank you so much. Great night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.